Hello and welcome to this thought for the day. I wanted to talk today about the Gospel reading for Friday, which comes from John chapter 16 and contains in it that story of the joy that comes after the birth of a child, the joy that makes the mother forget all about the pain and suffering beforehand. Jesus is talking about joy in the time where he faces his own suffering. And some people would ask the question, well, is it possible for human beings to experience true joy in the midst of grief or loss or pain? When I ask this question, I turn to one of my favourite books, a book by the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. Frankl was interned in a concentration camp in Auschwitz during the Second World War. And because of his training, it was natural for him to look at the behaviour of those around him and to study it. And in his observations, he noticed that two groups of people emerged. First were the group of people who succumbed to the situation, who lost hope, who found no joy in their terrible sufferings. But he surprisingly noticed another group. And this group of people had hope for the future. And in that hope, they were able to find at least a modicum of joy. Their hope necessarily wasn't religious. They might hope to see their family again when things were all over. They might hope to paint again. They may hope to play the piano again, enjoy the company of family. In those circumstances, they found that modicum of joy. Joy is intrinsic to the Christian faith. It's a joy that comes from the essence of God. And I wanted to offer just three examples of this joy and why we might be able to grasp it. Firstly, we know of God's love. We know of God's love for us. For example, in John chapter 3, in the discussion between Nicodemus and Jesus, we come to those amazing words. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that those who believe in him may not perish, but have eternal life. We come to know of God's love, and that can only give us some joy. Then we experience God's providence. And I want to turn for an example there to John chapter 6 and the feeding of the 5,000, where those very small offerings, the fish and the loaves, become that marvellous feast. We too know of God's providence, and that brings us joy. And then there's joy in the anticipation that God will draw all things to completion. At the beginning of John chapter 14, Jesus promises his followers a place in the Father's mansion. Now, as I was thinking about those examples, I noticed that there was something perplexing about them as well. Nicodemus is certainly perplexed as he discusses being born again with Jesus. How can a person be born again? And the crowd, they're perplexed because even though they've had their fill, the food runs out. There's no more feasting to be had, and a lot of them go away. And the disciples are perplexed at Jesus' promise because they can't understand why he needs to go at all. Well, the joy of God comes in the midst of those perplexing moments because it's not mere happiness. It's not dependent on everything being peaceful around us. It's not dependent on how much we are in control of any particular situation. It's not stifled, even though, as the psalmist writes, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Our joy is of the essence of God. As we know God's love, we experience God's providence, and we are drawn into God's completeness.